Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. I would like to welcome you to FortneyScott's COVID-19 weekly briefing. These briefings are held every Monday and cover the latest topics and developments impacting the workplace with regard to COVID-19. This briefing will be recorded. Everyone who registered today will be registered for all future briefings. The weekly briefings will continue as long as circumstances develop with regard to COVID-19. I would like to address some preliminary items before we start today's briefing. Currently, all listeners' phones are muted. At any point in time during the presentation, please feel free to submit a question in the GoToWebinar question box. We will try to answer all questions. Today's weekly briefing will address key wage and hour and compensation challenges. The presenters include FortneyScott attorneys David Fortney, Elizabeth Bradley, and John Clifford. I will now turn the program over to David Fortney to start our weekly briefing.
Terrific. Thank you, Valerie. Welcome, everyone. We're so glad to have so many of you back, and along with some new folks. And Liz Bradley and John Clifford, very nice to have you aboard this time and be with you, albeit virtually. Let's just do a couple of preliminary things and then we'll jump right into it. There's a lot of wage and hour and compensation updates and twists and turns that we want to focus on that arise in the context of the COVID response. But let's take care of a couple of housekeeping matters first. First, on the next slide, just a brief word about who we are. We are a law firm based here in Washington, D.C. Our practice focuses on the workplace and the federal agencies that enforce the obligations relating to the workplace, in particular the wage and hour and prevailing wage obligations that are going to be the focus of what we're discussing today. Obviously, today's materials are to provide you with general information, and although many of the issues we are discussing are legal in nature and relate to legal developments, our role today is not to provide you with legal advice, but you are encouraged to do so through your corporate counsel or through experienced outside counsel. We have the privilege of working with many of you and on these matters, and we do appreciate that. Well, let's take a moment and touch on the agenda before we get rolling. With that, and I'll jump on that. Or Liz? Looks like you're about to say something.
I can take it. Sure. Sure. I was going to take it but if you go ahead.
Okay. Looks like I'll take it then. So we're going to cover the recent developments and updates, obviously, as we do at the beginning of each week. We're going to then focus with respect to the wage and hour and compensation issues. We want to spend the bulk of our time delving into some of those. Particularly, we want to talk about the Fair Labor Standards Act considerations, particularly with respect as employers increasingly are looking at alternative compensation work schedules. We want to ensure that there's not inadvertent violations of the Fair Labor Standards Act. A very important issue that we're seeing in our practice dealing with many clients is really understanding what is compensable work. How do you go about figuring that out, particularly while most people, as we are today, are working from home with many other competing demands on their schedule? What is compensable work? How do you keep track of time tracking, particularly for non-exempt employees? When do you move into overtime when people are bouncing between working in their home office, doing a load of laundry, or in my case, dealing with the plumber this morning, and bouncing back and forth? How do we address all those and still make sure we're compliant? And finally, we also, many of you are federal contractors, and Liz is going to lead a discussion for us under the Service Contract Act, dealing with the new leave compliance obligations and a kind of a tricky area about how those fit together. And finally, and we put this on the agenda because of pay equity considerations. And we put that on the agenda because as we are seeing folks really kind of retool and in some cases on a broader basis start to think about recalibrating people's pay and in many cases cutting people's pay because of the very challenging business environment, how do we ensure, what steps do we do to ensure that we don't inadvertently end up with a resulting unlawful impact on pay? So let's talk a little bit about, let's start with what happened last week, and that's normally what we like to jump off with. So let's talk first about what did happen last week on that. This has been something that we have now presented, it's our 11th or 12th time. I'm starting to lose a little track myself, but it's all been COVID related. Primarily last week, as we all know, was not COVID related. We're all Washington, D.C. based. We saw everything that happened in our city. We saw the Black Lives Matter initiative and movement. The photograph here, of course, is Lafayette Square, just on the north side of the White House, for those that don't recognize that scene. Of course, this shows the fencing in place after what happened earlier in the week. But to some degree, not totally, but these issues, very significant issues, have somewhat superseded some of the push and pull that we have seen on COVID. COVID continues, but in kind of a broader context now of social unrest, of people clearly very concerned about a number of issues, and whether they come out of their houses or not for work, a willingness to come out. Yesterday, Sunday, we had, I think, about 10,000 people on the mall down in Washington, D.C., all very peaceful, but putting to the test the question of social distancing. Most people wearing masks. You see that this photograph is representative of that. I know some of our team was actually involved in some of these efforts, which is terrific. But the questions of, I think people are beginning to ask is, well, if we can go out and do this, can other parts of our lives begin to reopen as we look at that?
Yeah.
So I don't know, but this I don't think this changes I don't think we have turned the page from COVID, but I think that the COVID conversation now is more broadly informed, because certainly one of the aspects of COVID is that although it is a disease that will challenge anyone, we do know that it has disproportionately affected the African American community, persons of color, and there are different segments of our population and of our workforce that have been disproportionately affected by COVID. And that is a genuine concern that I think is now, and appropriately now, becoming part of the broader discussion of how we in the United States deal with COVID. All right, well, let's talk a little bit about the next slide, please. John?
Yeah. Thank you, David. Yeah, we just have this a handy map here. As David mentioned, where the country is moving towards a reopening phase, and as this map shows, it is almost every state is now in some phase of reopening. The blue states here are statewide reopening, albeit at different phases through different methods, and the sort of yellow with stripes on them those are regional reopenings, but still moving in that direction. So I think this really hammers home the point that across the board, almost across the board, states are in some sense reopening, and obviously along with that is going to mean eventually a return to work for a lot of workers, along with some other activities. Liz, I believe you had some statistics on sort of what the general populace is saying about what they would or would not be interested in doing these days.
Absolutely. And I do think, chiming back to what David mentioned, I think we see people were out and about these past weekends. They're out doing protests. They're out marching. So people are ready to get out of their houses, and we're seeing that. And there's some data from the Back to Normal Barometer. They did a survey, and it came out that 66% of the people surveyed are ready to take a cruise. Now that I just think is weird. Just pause on that. I'm not sure I'm ever a cruise person, but 66% of people are ready to take a cruise. 60% are ready to go back to live sporting events. 52% are ready to go stay in hotels. So people are ready to get out of their houses. But what's really interesting, of that same population that was surveyed, 45% expect to still be able to work from home. So they're not ready to go back into the workforce at the same numbers that they're ready to go out to see live sporting events. So employers are going to be dealing with this. As your employees are ready to get out of their houses, are they all going to be coming back to work, and at what rate? So I think we're going to be seeing this, and as we talk through some various issues, how we are going to be adjusting workforces, schedules, salaries to adjust the new normal, and what is the normal going to look like going forward.
Well, I think the survey also underscores that many people, particularly those that are working from home, as opposed to those that are laid off or not working at all, but those that are working from home, although not perfect, particularly many have children that are not in school or camps, summer camps and so forth, so they're struggling with those schedules, still are finding maybe this is a little better combination for them than having to be back in an office with the commuting and that other schedule. So it's an interesting pivot point and continues to be a pivot point. And I think that the most recent activities of the past week suggest it isn't that people necessarily are scared because of the disease. They're willing to come out of their homes for a whole lot of reasons. And the information you just walked us through underscores that. Baseball game, I'm all over it. Cruise, great. Work, not so fast. So
not so much.
So that becomes a dynamic, and we've talked about that employers are encountering the reluctance to come back, the unwillingness to come back.
Yep.
So.
Yep. And how to handle that, and some schedule changes, and John and I are going to talk about that as we get into this a little bit further, and that's what we're going to cover here today, some of those considerations to think about. Great.
Okay. Well, let's cover one other thing that was significant last week, and that's the PPP program. There had been general concern about the program being too limited, potentially expiring, because people had been so locked down that there had been frustration that not enough businesses that were eligible had been able to take advantage of the program. Also were some criticisms that perhaps larger businesses that weren't the intended beneficiary had swooped in and taken advantage when they shouldn't have. So we know that there's been several attempts to amend and extend the PPP. Well, last week, and I think this was largely totally washed out by the headlines, but the PPP program was significantly amended in a very favorable way for extending the program. This was the House had passed the bill before. We talked about that. Last week, the Senate, by unanimous consent, keep in mind the Senate, which rarely can agree on anything, unanimously agreed to pass the bill, largely in the form put to it by the House. And on Thursday, the President signed the bill. So now the key elements that we have from this is that instead of an 8-week window, because we're more than 8 weeks since the PPP program went into effect, we now have 24 weeks in which those that are eligible for this program and are using it. Additionally, there was the focus was initially that 75% of the money had to be spent on payroll. And what we found from experience was there's a lot of other costs, legitimate costs that folks were having, including having to pay rent and keeping buildings, paying for space, even if it wasn't being used. You had to maintain the building, pay the rent, etc. And the PPP monies could be used for that. And that there's been a delay, so maybe the 75-25, which was the original allocation, 75% on payroll, 25% on rent and other authorized overhead, that needed to be retooled. So the new bill, the extension now takes it out to 60-40, which I think for many businesses, that additional flexibility, very, very welcome. It also allows the program to extend all the way out till December, which again is very helpful, and recognizes there continue to be delays in businesses reopening. Per the point, even though the map shows this is very, very recent, but I think the key thing is when those states, going back to the map that John showed us, when the states turn blue, the restaurant may open and those employees may come back, but a lot of businesses are not back. They're not back. So we have people, some retail, some restaurants, a little bit of that activity is coming back in somewhat limited form, but the day-to-day going to the office, that is starting much more slowly. And I think that we will see that, but that's still coming up. Any other questions, comments, I should say, by John or Liz on kind of the update from last week?
No, I think we covered it, and I do think, to your point, I think the other events in the world really took priority last week over some of the COVID developments. But we need to stay focused on looking at how to come back to work and getting the wheels back on the bus and moving forward to bring our employees back.
I agree. Well, then let's turn right into some of the direct wage hour topics and go from there.
So this first set of items we're going to talk about is compensation, assignments, and schedule changes. So there's specific to your exempt workforce. So we want to look at some of the adjustments that you're making to exempt employees, both compensation and schedule, just to make sure that we do not lose their exempt classification, because that's going to be a very important consideration. A lot of different moving parts are going on, but we cannot forget the baseline applicability of the FLSA, and let's protect that classification. So the very first thing we look at is the salary basis test. If you are reducing schedules or reducing salaries, doing across the board 20% reduction, or you're going to reduce their schedules and therefore create a salary reduction, keep in mind the salary basis test. Under the FLSA, to maintain your exempt classification, they have to be making at least $684 a week or $35,568 a year. That cannot be prorated. That actually has to be what they're earning. So take a beat and look at that. We also have on here the highly compensated exemption amounts. Be careful. This is the baseline. Look at your state and local laws. Many states and different localities have a higher level. So you may, if you keep your federal, you may lose your local exemption. So make sure you're clearly checking the salary basis for your exempt employees before you start doing across the board salary reductions. And there's some considerations here. If you're going to do a 20%, you can simply say, we're doing a 20% across the board up to the salary basis test. So anybody that is at that level, you don't reduce them the full 20%. It's a way to keep it uniform, but still maintaining the exempt status.
Let me just note one practical point on that, Liz. If you do just take the percentage and you cap people so they don't fall below the salary threshold, likely whereas before you would have presumably in a well-designed compensation system had separation and different rungs, you now have created a compression problem, and maybe a temporary problem. You may be willing to live with it during the pandemic time, but that's just one consequence. When you get people that are in the $40,000 range, $40,000 to $45,000 range, and you're going to start taking 20% off, this is the point you really got to be mindful of. 20-25%, because a lot of organizations are looking at that type of pay adjustment, and be very mindful of that. Good.
And to kind of skip ahead to David's going to talk about pay equity later, but a teaser on that is you need to be looking at these salary compression pieces when you're doing your pay equity model, and how are you grouping those people so that that compression doesn't cause flags. But I won't belabor to that point.
Another thing that we expect a lot of employers will be dealing with, especially as they're sort of feeling their way through these phased reopenings, is having to reduce schedules, or many employees having reduced schedules. And one thing we just want to note is when you're dealing with exempt employees, even if there's a reduction in their schedule, it's important that to remain exempt, they must be paid, or if they're on salary, they must be paid their full weekly salary for any work performed during the week. So even if they have a couple days cut from their regular schedule, they still need to receive that full salary. You cannot be prorated based on any reductions. Now, if you're expecting those reductions and you can look ahead a little bit, there are ways to prorate salaries in advance. You have to look to whether your state has any notice requirements and comply with those. You have to let them know, the employee, of course, know that this reduction will be taking place, that they'll be receiving a prorated amount. We certainly recommend using a consistent reduction methodology whenever you're applying these to different employees throughout a business. And again, this goes back to what Liz was just discussing. You need to make sure that even with any reduction, you're meeting that annual salary level. Again, federal and state and local across the board. You need to take a close look at those and make sure that any prorated reductions are not going to take them below those levels. And if we could roll to the next slide, another thing that we're seeing here is that as people are coming back to work, there's has been and there's going to be certainly a reallocation of job duties, whether that's from a reduction in force at a business or just dealing with different responsibilities that go along with reopening. So if there are reallocations of job duties, and we've touched on this before, but really wanted to just emphasize it again for everyone, is that you need to make sure that any exempt employees continue to meet the primary duties test. What does that mean? It means that their primary duty is that exempt work that they, whether they're an executive or an administrative, and you see the list on the screen here, professional or computer employees. And we've just put in a few of the specifics of what that exempt work is for each type of employee here. Whether it's managing 2 or more full-time employees for executives, certainly with reduction in force, keep an eye on that, or doing the correct non-manual work for administrative employees. So, Liz, did you want to mention something here?
Sorry, I apologize. There's a little bit of a delay. So, so one of the things to think about here is if you are going to reallocate job duties because you've had a reduction in force, one of the best practice recommendation is if you take the exempt job duties of an employee who's not coming back and realign them to a coming back exempt employee. Keep the exempt to exempt, non-exempt to non-exempt. That's going to help protect so that you're not reallocating a significant amount of non-exempt job duties to an exempt employee, which then could destroy the exempt classification of the primary duties test. And another thing to think about is there is a presumption, under the DOL has a presumption that if 50% of your duties meet the exempt requirements, then that is a presumption of exempt classification. That's a presumption of the duties. So you want to be looking closely at those allocations of your returning workforce before realigning work so that you make sure that you are protecting the duties.
I think this is something that is particularly a really tricky area, because a lot of organizations, as they come back, we're talking about a skeleton crew, 25%, 30%, they're going to be on site. So what that means is a lot of the work that's getting done on site, fewer people doing much broader range of duties, which is okay. And I think that Liz's practical tip of, if you're going to realign, try to keep the exempts doing other exempt duties. There's also a combination exemption, which one of my personal favorites, that gives you a lot of running room on defending if you get challenged. But it is really important that there's this overarching and sometimes feels like overwhelming organizational pressure to bring people back and get them back in the office. So this is just a wake-up call reminder for all of you. There are ways of reconfiguring your skeleton crew to make sure that you remain true to these job duties requirements. So these are important points, really important points. Good.
Very important. Yeah. Okay.
So I know. Next up, we're just going to touch on some of the difficulties of tracking compensable time and how you can sort of take steps to make sure that employees are compensated correctly. That's both as they return to work with the new activities or tasks that they may have before them, or as Liz mentioned previously, a lot of these workers are going to want to continue working from home, and some of the pitfalls surrounding record keeping and timekeeping there. So we can move on to some of these pre and post work activities here.
Sure. So looking at, like John said, one of the first things we have to look at as the new normal workplace, what are some new duties, what are new activities we're asking them to do in light of coming back under COVID, and is that going to be compensable time? And one of the first things we are all thinking about and looking at is any of these pre and post COVID related activities, such as temperature checks. What's the process of that? When everybody waits in line and they take temperature for coming in the building, that's a very minor amount of time, probably in and of itself. That's probably not compensable. But how long is the line? What is the wait? When does something like that kind of activity become compensable time? Another question are these questionnaires. We're having some employers are asking employees about their activities. Have they been exposed? What are they doing? When are you filling out those questionnaires? Is that something you're doing at home before coming into the workplace? Is that something you're doing when you first log in at the beginning of your day? So thinking about the timing of those and whether or not you're expanding the work week or work day, and John's going to get into that in a moment, but we need to think about these. Another area that we're seeing is putting on PPE. So in the traditional, I think we've all heard the donning and doffing cases, right? Talking about when you're putting on equipment and stuff to go into a warehouse or other type of facility. But now we have that a new level that it's not just warehouse employees. It's employees who did not usually or traditionally have to put on equipment. But you may have office employees who are choosing to come in and you may be putting on PPE, depending on the type of mask, whether it qualifies for PPE or if it's just a face covering. So these are some things we're talking about. And the question is, can you rely on it as being de minimis? Is, okay, the pause at the front door to have your temperature taken, that's only a snapshot in time. It's very little. Be careful of where you're located. For example, California and Washington have not adopted the de minimis concept within wage and hour. So you can't just say, oh, it's such a short amount of time, we don't have to pay. Some states you are absolutely going to have to pay. More flexible if you're just governed by the FLSA. In thinking about these, go ahead. Sorry, John.
Oh, Liz, I just wanted to say, right on that point, I think some of the states said some of those pre and post work activities, such as temperature checks. For instance, California, if people are required to take their temperature before coming to work, the employer may be required to provide those thermometers. So it is really all of these activities. There's different items that need to be considered on state by state levels.
One of the questions that we're seeing in terms of how people may be compensated. So let's assume you don't have de minimis. Is compensation? I mean, you could literally start them on the clock. You could take the position, and obviously we're talking about non-exempt employees. For exempt employees, this is not an issue, unless you want to give them some COVID-related bonus, as some do. But compensation options could include a fixed amount for this, something that represents, or it could be that you actually start the shift. Back to Liz's scenario, if they're standing in line waiting to have their temperature checked, kind of depends on, is the line one person long, 50 people long, how long are they in line, and how do you determine when they clocked in under that scenario? Those are points that before you start mustering everyone that need to be addressed and thought through and communicated to employees so that they understand that before they come in.
Exactly. And if you choose to do an assumed rate, so maybe you make an assumption that it's adding 10 minutes to their day and you pay them that extra 10 minutes or whatever the time is, be sure you keep records of how you maintained that estimate, what did you use to determine that number, so it's a reasonable number, and then you're going to have to make sure you're maintaining accurate time records that you add on that amount of time to their weekly timesheets. So there's a lot of logistics that need to be considered with each one of these activities.
Agreed. Okay.
Good. Next slide.
By the way, that little picture, as we move off that slide, that's the Lake Ozarks gathering, and that gets to whether employers are going to inquire about non-work activities, whether they're going to take time to do that. Were you at protests this weekend? Were you at Lake Ozarks over Memorial Day, et cetera? Legitimate question. All right. Other returning to work activities.
Right. So in addition to some of those activities that Liz was just discussing, you could expect to be a little more day-to-day, regular activities. But what about just getting back to work, getting your workers back? Are there steps you need to take to get to that point? Certainly, a few things that we've seen popping up here are things such as training and reorientation. Liz, I know you dealt with that, if you'd like to speak to those.
Sure. So there's a lot that we're going to train our employees on is protocols for example, protocols for coming back into the workplace. How are you going to pay them? How are you going to communicate this? Is there new time tracking requirements associated with these items? So think about how are you going to do that training? Is it going to be done prior to the return to work? And how are you going to track the amount of time? I would assume that training, I would say, is going to be compensable time. You're teaching them how to come back into the workplace. Either it's training or a reorientation about the new rules of the workplace, the new structure. There's a few ways you could do that. You could do a mini training, sort of how to get in the front door training that's done beforehand. So that's the only extra compensation. Then you can do maybe the first thing that they come back after they've clocked in on the first day. That's when they run through the 30-minute, hour training session about whether or not they can use the kitchens and what they can do within the doors. So there's ways to structure your training so that not all of it is additional compensable time. You can do some of it at the front end, and then the bulk of it once they are at their desks, and it can be training that's done within the workplace. Another that we've seen is PPE fittings. Is that sorry? I think we can go back one slide.
Yep,
sorry.
Perfect.
So other, PPE fittings and non-PPE fittings. So if your employees are going off and have to be fitted, formally fitted for a PPE, is that compensable time? I mean, David, what are your thoughts on that?
Potentially. Again, it depends. If you are requiring a face covering and the demands are more, PPE is a term of art, as Liz indicated earlier, under the OSHA regulations. And you have certain obligations in terms of fit and testing it and ensuring it fits and how you maintain it and clean it. Face coverings, which are the more casual, the bandanas, the other things that we see, most of us see when you go to a retail establishment now. Other than a basic instruction that when it's required, some other basic instructions, that may come closer to a de minimis notion. But formal PPE fittings and so forth, likely compensable. We've got some clients that are currently struggling with that issue right now. In fact, later today, we have a conference with them to address that. So it's important. How about accommodation discussions?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, John, do you want to chime in on this piece?
Yeah, I think if these are, time taken out of the day for these accommodation discussions, certainly we'd expect people coming back, maybe raising certain health issues or accommodations that they expect to have or are inquiring about as they return to the workplace, or potentially working from home as well. That's whether or not they're raising that through the appropriate channels, the amount of time to respond to that, certainly you have to take into consideration. But these are things that we certainly expect will be happening for most employers as they're coming back, and that you have to consider that time. Absolutely.
Okay, well, let's move on.
Talk a little bit about
the continuous workday. John, you want to kick that off?
Sure. So the continuous workday rule here, and just a quick review, that typically the general continuous workday rule is that for non-exempt employees, all time between the first and last principal activity of the day is considered compensable time. So once you start working for the day, you're going to be paid for all of your time spent that day or throughout the day until you stop working for the day. Now, during COVID-19, as part of the FFCRA, the DOL temporarily suspended the rule for teleworking employees. So if you're working from home because of COVID-19, employers are only required to pay those employees for the time spent. So if they take a break, if they have to work in the morning, then take a break maybe to help their kids, make their kids lunch, and then get back to work. After that, you would only pay them for the time spent in the morning, and then again, once they return to work in the afternoon. So again, because this is part of the FFCRA, it would expire at the end of December, and this would only apply to employers with fewer than 500 employees. So I just wanted to make note of that anytime we're discussing the FFCRA here.
And I think what's really what I think is really important here is you have a lot of employees who are currently teleworking and are very used to that flexibility. They'll get up in the morning, maybe while the kids are eating breakfast or early, and they'll log on and they'll do some emails and they'll do some of their job. And then they take a break to help their kids, and then they come back and they spread their day out. It's probably a longer work day than what they normally do, but they're probably working about the same amount of time because they're able to take these midday breaks and to do what's necessary in the house. Your employees can be used to that. So what's going to happen January 1 when the continuous workday rule is back in place, when the temporary suspension is up? How are you going to manage that workforce? And because a lot of the people who may not be going back into the workplace. So I think we have to be very careful to be looking at what are your policies, what are your rules, what are your time tracking techniques right now, and get the groundwork set up now to be properly tracking their time, so that come January 1, you don't end up with a continuous workday rule violation. And now you have somebody who's sending emails starting at 6 a.m., and they may take breaks all day, but you don't have records of it. They're sending their last email at 9 p.m., and now you're having to pay them, especially your non-exempt employees. You're going to be walking into a very long and potential significant amount of overtime under this rule.
One of the things that I think a couple things recognize under the continuous workday, unless you had a break of more than 20 minutes, even if you took a short break, it was presumed to be compensable, at least by the Labor Department. That was the standard they would follow. So you could have an unpaid meal break, as most organizations did, but this hopping in and out from your home office to tend to the circumstances around your house, many times people step off for 10 or 15 minutes, help the kids with the homework, put a load of laundry in, come right back, this type of thing. The traditional concept would be that you're still, quote, on the clock, but it may just take you longer to get the task done because you're taking more breaks than you would have if you were just in the office, going to the restroom, getting a coffee, what have you. So, and I think this is something that most employers, our experience has been, are not really, tracking this terribly closely or really thinking this through. I think they're still presuming you have an 8-hour schedule, you're working an 8-hour day, and they're sort of glossing over some of the detail, which I think is potentially at their peril down the road. Okay.
And David, just one more point on the continuous workday I wanted to touch on quickly is that that suspension is only for teleworking employees. So as people start to come back to work, keep an eye on, generally the commute is not compensable time, but if some of these pre-work requirements, temperature check, questionnaire, if they start to build up, just certainly keep an eye on, is that starting the workday? Now, if they're de minimis, unlikely that it would amount to that, but certainly something we want people to keep an eye on as they're sort of setting these requirements for their employees.
Terrific. Good. All right, let's talk quickly about fluctuating workweek.
Sure. We just wanted to touch on the fluctuating work week here. This is it's a method of calculating overtime that applies only to non-exempt salaried workers. So traditionally, not a large portion of the workforce. Under this method, the salary would cover straight time for all hours worked by those non-exempt employees, whether they work a few hours one week, a lot of hours the next week. It would be covered by that set salary, that without agreed upon salary. In the event they work overtime, any additional OT compensation would be 1/2 the regular rate for that week. And that regular rate would be calculated, time worked, amount paid divided by hours worked. And so you would calculate it on a weekly basis. And I just wanted to touch on that there. That's 1/2 the rate for that overtime is what they would get because they've already been provided the straight time amount from their salary. And just one more note on this is the DOL recently made an amendment here that clarifies that any extra pay provided to these employees, it would be compatible with the flexible work week. You can still use this method if you're giving them bonuses or shift differentials. Make sure that that extra pay is included in the calculation of the regular rate. So we wanted to touch on this just as people may have more employees with fluctuating schedules. It may be a viable alternative for pay, but don't want to spend too much time on this point, and we can keep moving along here.
Good. And that new regulation that John mentioned, I think was promulgated May 20th. So anyone that's using Fluctuating Workweek, you need to be sure and review that and make sure that you're taking full advantage of it. It's a pro-employer. It gives greater flexibility. It's a good reg. Okay, good. Record keeping. This I sort of alluded to, but John, you want to lead this? Kind of how do you keep track of people who are doing their laundry and running back and forth from their office?
Exactly.
Right. And we've touched on this with the discussion of the continuous workday, but again, with COVID-19 happening, suddenly, employers are dealing with more non-exempt employees working from home than most employers have dealt with before. And they're going to have to track that time and make sure they're paid correctly. And a lot of time, we've touched on this already, those employees may have irregular schedules. So how can we accurately track that time and compensate our employees for that time worked? We have a couple things, a couple suggestions here, such as trying to have well-defined work schedules, utilizing virtual sign-in sheets. Although, David, I know you raised a good point as we were discussing this regarding some employers rely on computer logins for tracking time, and that can lead to some issues.
Correct. I mean, if you think about it, you log in at 8 a.m. or so, but you've been doing all these other miscellaneous things. You may have worked an 8-hour day, but to Liz's example, your last email may have gone out at 9 o'clock that night, but you actually worked an 8-hour day, even though you did it over the span of 13 hours. And which is fine. I mean, most organizations embrace that. That's part of what we're trying to do. What we're trying to guard against is that we make sure that doesn't inadvertently trip ourselves into overtime that wasn't authorized, wasn't envisioned, certainly wasn't budgeted for, particularly in these times, and how to guard against that. And so more detailed time records is really the best solution.
And ensuring, I would say, end of week certifications. Send total hours worked to your employees. Absolutely. And have them execute a certification, whether that's online or however you do that through your payroll system. Have them say they only worked 8 hours, because that's going to be difficult for them if they bring a claim later saying they worked more in that week. You're going to have their certification. So that's a best practice I would recommend.
I agree with that, Liz. Well, Liz, while we've got you, why don't we jump right into the government contractor issue and wrestling with the service contract?
Sure. So, and I just want to spend, don't worry, don't everybody hang up the phone immediately. This is not a detailed dive into FCA. I promise we're not doing that to you today. But a few pieces of that we want to touch base on. First of all, going back on this record keeping, and I'm going to beat the drum on record keeping. If you have an SCA covered contract, remember, you're submitting certified payroll. So how are you ensuring that those hours are correct for any of your SCA-covered employees who are working remotely? So hopefully, we need to be making sure that you have certifiable payroll, so records. But the real thing I want to spend a moment talking about is the interplay between the SCA and when employees are on the FFRCA leaves. So just as a refresher, under the FCA wage determinations, you have to pay employees a specified hourly rate, prevailing wage rate. You also have to pay them health and welfare rate for every hour worked on the contract. There's also FCA vacation requirements and holiday pay or accrual requirements that are part of your wage determination. And again, these are for your non-exempt employees. In addition, if you have an SCA-covered contract that has federal sick leave included in it, and that was under an executive order that put in federal paid sick leave for certain covered contracts, FCA is one of those covered contracts, that applies federal sick leave to all employees. So all of your employees, non-exempt and exempt, who are working on the contract are accruing federal paid sick leave. And these little buckets are important as we talk about what you have to pay and what leave you're able to use and account when they're on the federal leave. So moving on to the next slide, and to kind of talk about the complexity of what benefits needs to be covered, let me kick this over to David for a minute just to talk about what are the buckets of leave that you can use the value for to satisfy your health and welfare benefits.
Right. So this just quickly, federal contractors typically do meet their benefits obligation under the FCA in one of two ways. You can pay cash in lieu of benefits, so you pay an hourly rate, and then you pay an additional supplement designated as benefits. You have to designate it on the paycheck to get credit. The more common rule is, because most organizations do have robust benefit programs, is that you tie into, and there's a number of standard benefits that you see listed here that are typically afforded to employees, which, and you can take, if you will, credit, you can take the cost of what that benefit costs, you break it down on an hourly basis, and you can then in turn use that to satisfy, to meet your FCA benefit obligation. Mm-hmm. So the question now really is that while, and these benefits are paid whether you're working or whether you're on an approved FCA leave. We want to hone a little bit now on vacation and holiday that go above the required amount. So let's delve right into that in the FFCRA.
Right. So, and just, you know, and right. So under the, so just as a reminder, under the FFCRA, there are two types of leave provisions that were granted. There's emergency family medical leave, which is an expansion of FMLA, and that gives an additional 10 days of paid leave for care for a child. For school daycare when school or daycare is closed. Excuse me. There's also the Emergency Paid Sick Leave Act, and that provides additional 2 weeks of paid leave for specified COVID-related reasons. So then on the next slide, we're going to talk about some of the nuances and get into how this overlap works. So under both types of leave, you must continue your health insurance. So if that's one of the provisions of your health and welfare benefits, that has to be continued. Okay, we'll just pause there because we're going to get to the next part. There's a little bit of a layering. Under the Emergency Family Medical Leave Act, you can require concurrent of accrued leave pursuant to a policy. So if you have employees who have accrued vacation, PTO, sick leave, you can allow them, if your policy says you exhaust accrued leave, you can require that they take that leave concurrent with the emergency FMLA. The emergency paid sick, you cannot use other leave concurrent with it. You cannot require that your employees use any accrued leave banks. And one of the specific things under the FCA, your employees will likely have accrued federal paid sick leave that they've accrued under the executive order. You cannot require the concurrent use of that, even though that's another form of federal paid leave. The emergency paid leave is on top of that. So your FCA employees may have various buckets of leave. They can take their emergency paid, that can't touch their federal paid sick. They then may have the buckets there for their federal paid sick. They use that. Then they may still have their accrued PTO or other policy leave. So you have to be very, very careful about requiring the concurrent use of leave when you have these different buckets. And so the last piece I want to talk about on the FCA is, do you have to pay the full health and welfare benefit value when your FCA covered employees are on a federal, either the emergency FMLA or the emergency sick? Likely no. But again, you have to look at, there's some nuance between the type of wage determination you have, but essentially the health and welfare and the prevailing wage rate have to be paid when you are performing work on a contract. During these leaves, they're not performing work on a contract. That's one element of a good faith reason why it's not due. Another reason is the federal leave that is provided under the FFRCA is not the type of leave that is anticipated or directed under the FCA that needs to be paid. If they are taking their FCA vacation, if they are taking their FCA provided sick leave, then you will have to pay that health and welfare benefit. So again, you need to look at what bucket of leave they're dipping from to determine what benefits need to be provided and continued. So this is really more of an issue spot.
Right, it's an issue spot, and this is something that has become very challenging, I think, so we're talking about employers that are 500 or less, because that's who's covered by the coronavirus special bills with the extended family and paid sick leave, and their Service Contract Act. This has become mind-numbingly complicated, and it's because everything has been a one-off, and no one has yet thoughtfully been able to put them together. And I'm not critical of the Labor Department because they've had statutes given to them by Congress, and these most recent statutes have been done in obviously a very hurry-up environment. But this is something, the only good news I can see in all this, there's no private cause of action. It is the Labor Department ultimately that is the enforcer, plus you have to certify in your payrolls that you're doing this correctly. So I think.
And I would just, one thing to look at is if you are starting and stopping those additional fringe benefits such as retirement, there may be a cost to the company to start and stop and a burden, either a cost to get in and out of the program or just an administrative burden. Often, depending on how much of that health and welfare benefit is those additional funds beyond your health care, it's probably not worth the risk to not pay it. Continuing it might be a less expensive option, but everybody needs to look at their own plans.
Good.
Okay, and I'm going to move on from that.
Yeah. So pay equity. John, do you want to kick that off?
Sure. And actually, Liz gave a preview of this earlier in our discussion, but a lot of these reductions in pay or salary, there's pay equity considerations that go along with those. We just wanted to touch on before we finish up today some steps you can take, to try to avoid any systemic compensation discrimination claims that might accompany those. So obviously when you're making your pay adjustments, we want people to, it's important to be mindful that you're not creating any disparities. So unless you are using a standardized or quote unquote peanut butter style adjustments as they're being implemented, these could lead to unlawful disparities. And one recommendation we would make is that if you're making significant adjustments along the way, certainly include a pay analysis with this. And David, if you wanted to, I know we have provided some steps through the pay analysis here, if you wanted to walk through those.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So we'll jump into the next slide and I can hit some of these. The pay analysis is something, and we noted on there, but it's something that should be done on a privileged basis. And the protocols, I think, are well understood by the folks that are involved that do these. And we do these a lot with a lot of our clients, and we do them in a lot of different circumstances. Sometimes it's a pending government audit. Sometimes it's a claim. More often than not, the best practice is that these are done regularly as part of the compensation systems, typically on an annual basis. Well, now, with this kind of off-cycle event called the COVID problem, and many organizations having to recalibrate pay kind of on the run, we are suggesting and have been involved with clients that are saying, well, wait a minute, certain units, certain divisions, they're very unprofitable. We're really slashing their pay. We're moving people into other divisions. We're kind of staying alive as a business. That's great. The point here is that before implementing those revisions, best practice is that you would conduct a pay analysis. And obviously that involves a variety of stakeholders. Legal is integral in that because you want to do it, as I mentioned, so it's privileged. Human resources, compensation, benefits. Sometimes you have different management folks, and obviously whoever has the budget authority. Because if you determine there are problems, you need to fix them. That's one of the other standard protocols. But typically there will be data gathered out of your human resource information system, your HRIS. You will do an analysis, robust analysis, and we often work with third-party vendors that do statistical analytics is the best practice if the data allow it. And those studies will deliver what we refer to as preliminary results that often may have flags in preliminary indicators of disparities, of issues. That simply means that we have to do some additional legwork to see, is there a reason why? Is there a reason why when I moved Liz and John to the same job, I'm paying Liz so much more? Well, she's been red circled because she formerly was in a very high position and I changed her job duties, but I've decided I'm going to still pay her at that higher level. So that might be an example. I might have a flag, but that would be one that I'd be comfortable there's a bona fide reason. On the other hand, maybe there wasn't a bona fide reason, in which case making the adjustments and communicating those. So all those are, these are steps that can occur sometimes over a period of weeks or months. To be candid, they can be done over a much more compressed time period and need to be done over a compressed time period in these circumstances. Liz.
Yeah, I'd like to add on this, and I know we talk about doing this if you're going to be doing pay cuts and to looking at it, but another time I think you really need to be looking at pay equity is if you have furloughed and you're going to be slowly bringing people back and you're not sure what your full complement is going to be. I think looking at that and where you predict as you bring people, even if you didn't do initial cuts, as you come back and use a reduced workforce or a smaller complement of your employees, you should be looking at that pay equity as you bring people back, making sure that you're not going to be running into a larger problem.
I would agree, and I just would add and tie off with, many organizations may have a particular unit that has been significantly recalibrated, shall we say, readjusted in light of new workforce levels and compensation. And you may want to, instead of doing it corporate-wide, you may want to focus and do this type of pay study for that unit. Then you'd return back to your normal compensation cycle audits corporate-wide, and which is typically done late fall or the first quarter. All right. Well, we've covered a lot of ground. We're down to a few minutes left. Let's just do a little recap on some of these issues. First of all, we did touch a bit as a reminder on the FLSA's exemption requirements. And this is particularly true when you bring exempt employees back, skeleton workforces, you've got people doing a lot of different jobs. Make sure that those that you're relying on being exempt, because they're working more often than not, more than 40 hours a week, that you have not reallocated their duties. All of a sudden they're spending 95% of their time unloading boxes back on the dock because no one else is there. That could be a problem if they otherwise were exempt, at least for that work week. So that's something to keep in mind. Next, I'm sorry. John.
And another point is we just want to reemphasize understanding what is compensable work time, especially as workers are coming back and states are starting to reopen. There's going to be a time spent on a lot of new activities, whether it's temperature checks, we talked about questionnaires, or going through trainings and reorientations. Employers need to make those determinations of what is compensable work time. And going right along with that, maintaining those accurate the time records for non-exempt employees, making sure whether they're, especially if they're at home, making sure that you have accurate records so that you're paying them for the time they've spent working.
If you have a government contract, if you have SCA covered contracts, be sure that you are properly tracking time, ensuring you're paying the accurate prevailing wage rate. Also look at those benefits. How are you tracking? What type of benefits are you providing when your employees are out on any of the FFRCA leave provisions? Make sure that you are compensating them appropriately. Look at those carefully.
Terrific. And then the final thing we touched on, of course, are whether you're making significant pay adjustments, whether you should do a pay equity study. Probably yes. It doesn't need to be for your whole organization. It may be the affected components. And reminder again, please do it on a privilege basis. You can use your corporate counsel to do the privilege. That is a step that must be taken at the beginning. You do not get to push the do-over button and try to add counsel after the fact. So it is something that is very important, and we see a lot of well-intended people gloss over that threshold step, and then they have a non-privileged study that potentially can be very, very difficult if they face a request during an audit by the government or a litigation discovery claim. So be smart. Do one, but be smart. All right. Well, we're right on the top of the hour. I want to thank both Liz and John for joining this week. Terrific discussion on a lot of issues. And Valerie, I'll turn it back to you. We'll be back next week on the 15th.
We would like to thank you for joining us. As a reminder, you may view the previous weekly briefings on our website at www.FortneyScott.com. and all registrants from today have been registered for future weekly briefings. Be on the lookout for additional updates, which will be sent via email. Later today, you will receive a survey requesting feedback for today's presentation. You are able to submit suggestions for future topics through this survey. Our next briefing will be on June 15th. Thank you in advance for completing the survey, and, of course, if you have any questions, you may submit them via email to info@FortneyScott.com.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.